Call the hearing to order this morning, and today's the 9th day in our American Energy Initiative hearing, and today we're going to be discussing a more comprehensive plan to explore ways to produce the necessary energy for the American people. As you know, when we talk about energy, we talk about electricity is one part of it, and transportation and fuel for transportation is the other part of it. We also know that we have a vast amount of natural resources within the borders of the United States of America, and many of us believe that we have not been able to fully explore and produce from those natural resources. And there are many impediments out there to it. We also understand that natural resources here in America alone will not meet all of our demands for the future. We also recognize that not only must we use fossil fuels, but we have to use renewables, and we need to explore opportunities in more green ways to produce energy for the American people. But we also need to be realistic that by 2035, the amount of electricity, for example, needed in America is going to increase by about 50%. And we have to be realistic on recognizing the cost of green energy, how much can it realistically provide, and what will the cost of electricity be for the American people, because we find ourselves in a global marketplace in which we're competing with other countries around the world, and our electricity prices and transportation prices have to be competitive if we are going to be sure that businesses expand in the U.S., locate in the U.S., and we create jobs in the U.S. So I look forward to today's hearings. We have 3 panels today. On the first panel we have Devin Nunes, a member of Congress from California who's done extensive work on the energy needs of America and has actually developed legislation to address some of those problems and issues. So we look forward to his testimony, and at this time I'd like to recognize the gentleman from California for his opening statement, Mr. Waxman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Today we're holding a hearing on a bill that is titled Roadmap for America's Energy Future. Our nation faces major energy challenges, and we need to have a serious conversation about the American energy future. But I'm sad to say this legislation we're examining today proposes no innovative solutions to our nation's energy needs. It doubles down on oil, and it doubles down on old, ineffective policies. We've seen this roadmap before. This is a recycled version of a plan developed by the secretive Bush-Cheney Energy Task Force and pushed through Congress by Republicans while they were in office. The Bush administration and congressional Republicans spent 8 years following this roadmap. They pushed oil and gas drilling onshore and offshore. They expedited permits and weakened environmental protections. They opposed efforts to increase fuel economy. They called for nuclear fuel reprocessing. They tried to greenwash proposals for drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge by implying congressional appropriators could use royalty revenues to support renewable energy. They pushed the dirtiest alternative and unconventional fuels, coals to liquid, oil, shale, and tar sands. And where did they get this road? And where did this roadmap lead us? Energy prices soared and carbon pollution increased, and we become even more dependent on foreign oil. In the last year of the Bush administration, the Energy Information Administration projected that our dependence on oil and oil imports would continue to rise year after year. Today we are sending nearly $1 billion per day overseas for foreign oil. We use 25% of the world's oil, but we only have 2% of the world's oil reserves. We work to increase our domestic crude oil production by nearly 300,000 barrels per day, and yet gas prices remain high. Increasing oil production is not going to solve our energy needs. Even if we doubled our oil production, oil prices would still be set by world markets and leave us vulnerable to price shocks. H.R. 909's roadmap doesn't lead to the future. It leads to the past. The technology to turn coal into liquid fuel has been around since World War II. Its problem is the same as it has always been: huge amounts of carbon pollution that will drive uncontrolled climate change. American entrepreneurs and inventors are using technology to unlock real energy solutions, energy sources that are clean, safe, and affordable, and grow our economy. In testimony provided to the committee for today's hearing, we will hear that the wind and solar industries will create over 200,000 new jobs. But H.R. 909 would abandon our clean energy future to China. For many reasons, it is unlikely to help renewable energy because of flaws in its reverse auction mechanism. The bill does nothing on efficiency, which is the cheapest and most reliable new source of supply. It promotes the form of nuclear energy that risks putting nuclear bomb-grade material into the hands of terrorists. It does nothing to develop carbon capture and storage, the technology that coal needs to remain a competitor in a carbon-constrained world. In 2001, Vice President Cheney said, "Conservation may be a sign of personal virtue, but it is not a sufficient basis for a sound, comprehensive energy policy," end quote. 10 years later, the Republican budget defunds the federal investment in energy conservation and innovation. The rest of the world has been racing ahead over the last decade. It's too bad the Republicans' energy policies have not. We've seen this roadmap before, and we know where it leads us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to recognize Congressman Devin Nunes for his opening statement regarding his legislation. And Congressman, we're delighted you're here before the subcommittee, and we look forward to your testimony, and thank you for being here.
Well, I do appreciate that, Mr. Chairman and the ranking member, for allowing me to testify here today. It's an honor to be before the Energy and Commerce Committee. In fact, I've never been before the Energy and Commerce Committee before, so it really is an honor and a privilege for me to be here today. Our nation has been blessed with great abundance of natural resources. Consider these astounding facts. ANWR potentially contains 10 billion barrels of oil. The Outer Continental Shelf is estimated to hold 85 billion barrels of oil and 420 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and over 2 trillion barrels of oil are held in oil shale deposits, more than are contained in all the countries in the Middle East combined. Additionally, our nation has nearly 250 billion tons of recoverable coal reserves, which is the estimated equivalent of 800 billion barrels of oil, and constitutes more than 3 times Saudi Arabia's proven oil reserves. Unbelievably, our government has chosen not to utilize these resources fully, despite the repeated promises to achieve energy independence by both Democrats and Republican administrations and Congresses alike. But continued inaction is unacceptable, with stubbornly high unemployment, lackluster economic growth, widespread unrest in the Middle East, and the prospect of escalating gas prices punishing American families. Nothing done by our government in the past 4 decades has actually helped to achieve the goal of energy independence, or for that matter, kept energy prices affordable for American families and businesses. The reverse is true. We are more dependent on foreign oil today than ever before, and far more economically vulnerable than at any point in our nation's history. If we summon the political will to enact this legislation before the committee, H.R. 909 would reverse this course, immediately lower energy prices, and finally deliver on the unfulfilled promises of recent decades. The energy roadmap is not a radical alternative to current energy policy. That is, while we can all agree that we need a comprehensive approach, this approach must be market-based and gradual. If we are to achieve true energy independence, I predict that any other approach will ultimately be rejected by the American people. The energy roadmap would lift restrictions on development and extraction of resources in ANWR and OCS. This could create up to 2 million jobs. and maybe even just the construction of these jobs would create another 100,000 construction jobs. The roadmap recognizes that the dependence on any one fuel source is dangerous and short-sighted. It also recognizes that the American people have made it clear that they do see the merit in federal resources to develop and transition to alternative energy sources and to reduce carbon emissions when economically and technologically feasible. The status quo does not provide adequate support to the development of alternative energy. It is not necessarily a question of resources as much as it is a question of the appropriate structure to deliver support for the development of renewable energy. For example, while many renewable energy companies support the current production tax credit, they are frustrated with its lack of predictability and that it can get caught up in the legislative process and lapse. Accordingly, H.R. 909 would provide the financial resources and structure necessary to transition our economy to renewable and advanced energy alternatives. It would do this by depositing the new federal lease and royalty revenues, estimated to be over $500 billion in the next 30 years, into a trust fund. These dollars would then be made available to renewable energy producers through a reverse auction. This market-based mechanism would ensure that the cheapest and most efficient technology thrives, while simultaneously opening the alternative energy market to greater innovation and competition. Importantly, the roadmap would not end the credit. Rather, it would give an alternative to energy entrepreneurs to choose to receive the credit or to forgo it to receive support through the reverse auction. Moreover, the support provided under the energy roadmap for the development of renewable energy would not be subject to the federal budget or the legislative process. Put simply, it provides the best mechanism to develop, produce, and transition to alternative energy. Another component of the roadmap would establish or would mandate that 200 reactors permits be granted by 2040. This bill would provide new streamlined regulations and a system to manage the waste that will drive private sector investments in these facilities, which today are stalled as a result of red tape, lawsuits, and parochial concerns. Nuclear power, in my estimation, is essential to achieving an abundant and affordable supply of electricity to fuel our nation's economy. H.R. 909 would enhance our national security by removing barriers to expand our nation's secure coal supplies to fill the tanks of the American military vehicles and jets. In fact, the bill's near-term goal is to produce at least 300,000 barrels of CTL, coal to liquid. Such supply would equal the amount of fuel consumed daily by the U.S. military for domestic operations. The American people are looking to us for leadership. They know intuitively that we are running out of time, and they are worried about the future of our country and for our country's future for their children. They have given us the opportunity to offer solutions to this and other big problems. My fellow colleagues, it's time for us to act, and I really do appreciate Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, for having the opportunity to testify here today.
Well, thank you, Mr. Nunez, for that testimony, and I'll recognize myself for a period of questions, and then we'll recognize Mr. Waxman for the same purpose. In your testimony, you talked a little bit about a reverse auction for a fund to encourage more development of renewable fuels. Would you elaborate a little bit on the way this reverse auction would work? Absolutely,
Mr. Chairman. I believe that despite the ranking member's testimony at the beginning, I think this is something that is new, is innovative, and it would change the way that alternative energy is deployed. Basically, to put it simply, you take the royalty revenues, which some people estimate to be $500 billion over 30 years. It could be higher, could be lower, but it's a significant amount of money. And what you do is essentially that money's there, and it acts as a reverse auction, so the lowest bidder wins. So if I could maybe give you an example, let's say that someone, one person has windmills that they want to put up in California, and someone has a windmill farm that they want to put up in Nevada. And if one company thinks that they need $100 to get their project off the ground in California, let's say it's $100, but in Nevada, that company for the same size project only needs $90. They would submit those bids, and it's per megawatt, and the Nevada company would win. So you would, it basically gets to the cheapest way to deploy renewable energy. And this has been, I think, met with in the Silicon Valley and the entrepreneurial community in California. This has been well received throughout the energy companies that want to see changes to the way these technologies are deployed.
Now, is there an example of where this type of reverse auction has been implemented in other places and has been proven that it works very well?
Yeah, matter of fact, it's a great question, Mr. Chairman. I was quite embarrassed to learn that when I developed this legislation, I thought that I had developed something new. In fact, this is being used in Brazil. And to my knowledge, although I've not talked to, I do co-chair the Brazilian caucus, which is even more of embarrassment that I didn't know that this was there. But from my understanding, it's working very well.
And they use it for the same purpose for the development of renewables?
Yes. And I think it would probably, for this committee, it would be worth your time maybe to look into that if you have another hearing.
We've heard a lot recently, particularly from our friends on the other side of the aisle, about removing production tax credits and other things from the oil industry. And without getting into a discussion about that proposal per se, I would like to just broaden it. And do you think it would be reasonable, or would it be helpful if we're going to have a debate about removing tax credits from the oil industry? In your view, should we have a debate about just removing incentives from all energy production?
In fact, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Camp and the Ways and Means Committee, we have been conducting a series of hearings on tax reform. And we've had many different companies from both foreign nationals and small businesses basically all say the same thing, that they would like to see the corporate tax rate reduced and would basically forego all of these types of little production tax credits and different tax credits that are out there. And so I think President Obama, you were at the meeting the other day, he indicated that this is something that he would like to do also. So I think simplifying the tax code, getting rid of all these credits would be something worthwhile, and that's what the Ways and Means Committee is working on.
And you all are working on that right now.
Yes.
Now, in your proposal, you talk about licensing 200 new nuclear plants in a relatively short time. I forgot if you said 2040 or whenever it was. But recognizing that we have this significant issue of how do we dispose of this waste, because the administration has basically stopped Yucca Mountain after the expenditure of $15 billion and after judgments against the federal government of about another $15 billion, and after taxpayers and energy users have paid the fee for providing funding for this. How do you propose that we would get rid of this waste?
Well, one of what I tried to achieve in drafting this legislation was that tried to create a scenario where the Congress forces an administration to act one way or the other on Yucca Mountain and reprocessing and a whole host of issues. Because as you know, it seems like every president, no matter if it's a Republican or a Democrat, they're all for nuclear power, yet nothing ever happens. Right. And I think that our country, I think the most significant innovation in the last 100 years, from my perspective, is the development of nuclear power. Right. And I think we've been set back in this country over the last 4 decades because we really have not invested in new nuclear technology. And we are in real danger of falling behind China, who, some folks estimate that they're on their way to build over 200 nuclear reactors. We don't really know, but I think they are building several dozen right now that are being built or in the process of it. So what this bill does is it basically forces the administration to say yes or no, and it develops a time frame so that we would either know that Yucca Mountain will be used or it will not be used, but we need to get to the bottom of that and get it, either stop it or start it.
Well, thank you, Mr. Nunez. At this time I recognize Mr. Waxman for his 5-minute question period.
Thank you very much for your testimony, and I think I might have been a little too harsh in my opening statement. I do want to consider your idea because I've long believed that we need to have market mechanisms to try to drive the results that we want. I don't think we can decide the winners and losers. We ought to say what we want to achieve and help the entrepreneurs in this country unleash them and let them go forward and profit when they accomplish the goals we want. That's what we try to do, not to everybody's satisfaction in the cap and trade bill, because we said if you can figure out new technology and ways to reduce the carbon emissions, it will be to your economic benefit. You'll be able to have a clear profit for it. You seem to be doing that in a very different way, but nevertheless you're trying to accomplish something that I find attractive, and I want to understand this more from you and from other witnesses later on.
Absolutely.
As I understand, in order to be eligible for the reverse auction, a renewable energy project developer has to have a power purchase agreement in place, and the price in that contract is essentially the bid in this reverse auction. It would seem that because the prices will already be set in the contract, generators will not be able to change their bids as the auction proceeds, and the price-driving mechanism of a traditional reverse auction will not be available. I assume the intent of the provision is to drive down the price of renewable energy. Isn't that what you're trying to?
That's correct.
And do you anticipate generators breaking or renegotiating power purchase agreements in order to lower their bids?
Well, one of the things, Mr. Chairman, and I do appreciate your comments as it relates to the reverse auction. It was a very difficult provision to draft, and we've spent several years doing it. You may remember that there in EPAC of whatever year that was, '05, there was something similar for renewable fuels that was put in. However, and the President actually has, I think, $150 million in his budget for that proposal. But the way that the law was drafted and then how the regulations were written, basically there's never been any money put into it, and there doesn't seem to be any interest from the renewable fuel community to utilize it. So what we attempted to do here was to keep it as clear and basic as possible, so that you would have a clean way to run this auction. So, I mean, this is actually probably an expertise of yours in this committee, but we actually modeled it after originally before I knew that other people had tried this. We modeled it after the spectrum sales, the way that you auction off spectrum sales. So that was kind of our goal. And then asking when the regs would come out to basically have kind of 3 different levels, so that you could have one level for technological development and research. You would have kind of a mid-size level so that maybe small businesses and folks could utilize the program, and then you would have another pot at the highest level for the big energy companies to go out and build, big wind farms or big solar farms. That's the attempt of the legislation. I think one of the options here is, in this bill, some of the oil provisions have moved through the House already. And I think there is an opportunity for this committee to maybe take this reverse auction and move it by itself, spend some time, to make sure that it works, in a bipartisan way, and maybe, get this bill marked up and get it out to the floor, just the reverse auction provision. I would be very supportive of something like that.
Do you have a concern that if there's a choice between a reverse auction and a production tax credit, that the production tax credit is more certain, and the businesses involved will decide to forego the reverse auction and stick with the tax credit?
I think that there is the uncertainty now in the production tax credit business is leading to a more complicated deployment of renewable energy, renewable power. I think there's some people that can use these credits, some people can't. And I think, and because I think, what is it, 2012, they lapse anyway. And if you just look down the road, I mean, when you have Republicans and Democrats agreeing that we need to get out of this tax credit business to some degree, I just don't think I think this program, having a trust fund in place where you take royalty revenue from oil and gas, is a way that that would give some real certainty.
My staff has expired, but let me thank you for your hard work on this legislation. You're a highly respected member of our California delegation and in the House, and I want to look at this more carefully because I do think we need a bipartisan approach, and I like the idea of something that will drive the markets rather than dictate the market.
Well, Mr. Chair, or Mr. Ranking Member, I would be willing to come and sit down with you and walk you through this, or your staff.
I don't walk through things when I'm sitting down, but I'll be glad to.
Well, as in keeping with the procedures of our committee, Congressman Nunes, the chairman and ranking member, are the only ones that would be asking you questions today. But our staff has looked at your legislation. You have some really innovative approaches like the reverse auction, and we're going to continue to look at that. And at some point work with other committees and try to move something to address some of the problems that you're trying to address in your legislation. So thank you for your time and for your involvement in this important issue.
Oh, I really appreciate it. Thanks for the opportunity, Mr. Chairman.
This time I'd like to call up the second panel of witnesses. On the second panel we have Mr. David Sandelow, who is the Assistant Secretary for Policy and International Affairs at the U.S. Department of Energy. And we also have Mr. Thomas Hicks, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And we'd like to welcome both of you to this hearing. We appreciate your taking time to be with us and offering us your expertise and knowledge. And with that, Mr. Sandelow, I'd like to recognize you for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
For example, the administration believes that facilitating the efficient, responsible development of our oil and gas resources is a necessary component of energy security. We're working to expand cleaner sources of energy, including renewables like wind, solar, and geothermal, nuclear power, as well as clean coal and natural gas on public lands. However, the administration has serious concerns with many provisions in this legislation. For example, a number of the changes in Title I would make amendments to Interior's offshore energy program, undercutting safety and environmental reforms adopted in the wake of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And it would open the coastal plain of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge to oil and gas drilling. Department of the Interior and other involved agencies may have additional views on this legislation. H.R. 909 touches on programs implemented by a number of administration's agencies, and I will not comment in detail about programs outside of the Department of Energy's purview. In the remainder of my testimony, I'd like to discuss the administration's energy agenda and address several specific provisions from H.R. 909. In the State of the Union address, President Obama laid out a plan for the United States to win the future by out-innovating, out-educating, and out-building the rest of the world, while at the same time addressing the deficit. Many countries are moving aggressively to develop and deploy the clean energy technologies that the world will demand in the coming years and decades. As the President said, this is our generation's Sputnik moment. We must rev up the great American innovation machine to win the clean energy race and secure our future prosperity. To that end, President Obama has called for increased investments in clean energy research, development, and deployment. In addition, he has proposed generating 80% of America's electricity from clean energy sources by 2035. A clean energy standard will provide a clear long-term signal to industry to bring capital off the sidelines and into the clean energy sector. It will grow the domestic market for clean sources of energy, creating jobs, driving innovation, and enhancing national security. And by drawing on a wide range of energy sources, including renewables, nuclear, clean coal, and natural gas, it will give utilities the flexibility they need to meet our clean energy goals while protecting consumers in every region of the country. The Department of Energy's goal is to strengthen the nation's economy, enhance our security, and protect the environment by investing in key priorities, including supporting groundbreaking basic research, leading in the development and deployment of clean and efficient energy technologies to reduce our dependence on oil, and strengthening national security by reducing nuclear dangers, maintaining a safe and secure and effective nuclear deterrent, and cleaning up our Cold War legacy. As the President said in his State of the Union address, investing in clean energy will strengthen our security, protect our planet, and create thousands of new jobs here at home. We're doing it through programs to make, for example, homes and buildings more energy efficient with the new Better Buildings Initiative. We're also developing new sources of wind, solar, and geothermal, supporting the modernization of the electric grid and carbon capture and sequestration technologies. We're reducing our dependence on oil by developing the next generation of biofuels and promoting electric vehicle research and deployment, supporting the President's goal of putting 1 million electric vehicles on the road by 2015. Mr. Chairman, I drove to work today in a plug-in hybrid vehicle. At night, I plug that car into an outlet in my garage. I often get 80 miles per gallon as I drive through the streets of Washington, D.C. And I'm pleased to say that today I drove to this hearing from the Department of Energy garage in one of the new plug-in electric vehicles in the Department of Energy's fleet. So I think building on the investment that we're making in this country in electric vehicles, we can bring down our dependence on oil. That's going to require further investment in lithium-ion batteries. And Mr. Chairman, someday I hope that one of my grandchildren will look at one of my children who are now teenagers and say, "What, you mean you couldn't plug in cars back when you were young?" The Department of Energy, we're also focused on moving clean energy technologies from the lab to the marketplace. Over the past 2 years, our loan programs have supported more than $30 billion in loans, loan guarantees, and conditional commitments. We emphasize, too, that nuclear energy has an important role to play in our energy portfolio. To jumpstart the domestic nuclear industry, the President's budget requests up to $36 billion in loan guarantee authority. It also invests in the R&D for advanced nuclear technologies, including small modular reactors. H.R. 909 takes a different approach to expanding nuclear power production. H.R. 909 creates a reverse auction mechanism to fund renewable energy projects, just discussed at the last panel. We share Representative Nunes's view that reverse auctions are a useful tool for promoting renewable energy. From our experience with reverse auctions, it's important to protect the taxpayers by requiring adequate assurance from bidders that they'll perform. We look forward to working with the committee on a provision that accomplishes our shared goal of promoting American renewable energy and protecting taxpayers. To spur innovation, the administration has prioritized investments in basic and applied research. These are discussed in more detail in my statement, which I have submitted for the record. Mr. Chairman, in conclusion, I want to thank the committee for inviting me to testify on issues associated with H.R. 909 that relate to the DOE's mission. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the President's roadmap for a clean and secure energy future.
Thank you, Mr. Sandalow. At this time, Mr. Hicks, you're recognized for a 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Whitfield and distinguished members, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today at this hearing on H.R. 909. While neither the administration nor the Department of Defense has a formal position on this legislation, I'm here to share with you the perspective of the Department of the Navy. As the Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy on Energy, I've been actively involved in assessing the policy, economic, technological, and environmental costs and benefits associated with the use of fossil fuels and alternative fuels. I and many members of my staff and colleagues have personally met with dozens of industry representatives of U.S.-based organizations from a wide range of interests, including alternative fuel companies, large oil companies, venture capital, private equity, and industry associations. We have also met with government experts from DOE, the Department of Defense, U.S. Department of Agriculture, NASA, EPA, and others. So the perspective provided here today is drawn on these discussions and on contemporary studies and analysis on the topic of alternative fuels. Changing the way the United States uses, produces, and acquires energy is one of the central policy challenges that confront the nation. It is something that Secretary Mavis cares deeply about, and it is something that the Navy and the Marine Corps, under his leadership, has been aggressively working towards for the last 2 years. As a military and as a country, we rely far too much on fossil fuels, far too much on foreign sources of oil. This dependency degrades our national security and negatively impacts our economy. Our dependency on fossil fuels makes us more susceptible to price shocks, supply shocks, natural and man-made disasters, and, as we've recently seen, political unrest in countries halfway around the world. The challenges we face today are not just about what types of fuel we use. or where and how those fuels are produced, clearly we must be more efficient in the fuels that we use. The best barrel of oil is the barrel of oil we do not use. The challenge we face in the Navy today is 280 ships we have today. The 3,700 aircraft are largely the ones we're going to have tomorrow and into the future. So focusing on new sources of fuel, drop-in replacement fuel is critical. For ships, being more efficient means we can increase the days between refueling, improving both its security and combat capability. Better fuel economy for aircraft means we can extend the range of our strike missions and enabling us to base them farther away from combat areas. Being more efficient and more independent and more diverse in our sources of fuel improves our combat capability both strategically and tactically. The Department of the Navy's interest in this topic of alternative fuels is fundamentally about improving our national security and our long-term energy security. The more we replace foreign sources of oil with more diverse, domestically produced alternative fuels, the better we are as a military and the better we are as a nation. How one successfully accomplishes that objective is where the debate lies and is a topic that the Department of Navy has a perspective. It's been recently suggested before this committee that the best near-term approach to meet the Department of Defense fuel needs is essentially a coal-derived or a mixture of coal-derived and biomass Fischer-Tropsch fuels. Fischer-Tropsch is a thermal-chemical conversion process invented and developed in pre-World War II Germany to convert resources such as coal, natural gas, and biomass to fuel oil. In this country, given the enormous quantities of biomass required and its relative limited availability at those scales required to run a Fischer-Tropsch or an FT plant, biomass as a long-term feedstock is typically considered. More often than not, coal is viewed as the primary, if not exclusive, feedstock, and as a result, in addition to requiring large new sources of coal, it requires enormous quantities of water, $5 to $10 billion in capital per plant to provide a fuel result that is more than twice as carbon intensive as petroleum. From the Navy's perspective, there simply are too many questions to suggest that this is the best near-term solution. In our ongoing dialogue with industry, venture capital, and the equity communities, one thing is clear. America's advanced biofuel industry knows no geopolitical boundaries, and unlike the proposed near-term solution, the feedstocks and refineries needed to produce advanced biofuels to power the fleet or our aircraft can literally be produced in every state, all 50 states. The U.S.-based companies comprising this industry that are currently producing or will soon be producing fuels across the spectrum from the tens of thousands of gallons to the tens of millions of gallons. These are companies new and old, some are small businesses, and some are now publicly traded. These companies represent the type of innovation and spirit needed to meet the energy demands of the future. Just to conclude, as a robust advanced drop-in biofuels market is an essential element of our national energy security. Energy security for the nation requires unrestricted, uninterrupted access to affordable energy sources to power our economy and our military. Traditional fossil fuel-based petroleum derived from crude oil has an increasingly challenging market and supply constraints. Chief among these is limited, unevenly distributed, and concentrated global sources of supply. Advanced biofuels that use domestic renewable feedstock provide a secure alternative that reduces the risks associated with petroleum dependence. Just in closing, I'd like to personally thank the committee for addressing the important topic of alternative fuels and for providing the Department of Navy the opportunity to offer its perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Hicks. We appreciate your testimony as well. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. Mr. Sandilow, you're Assistant Secretary for Policy and International Affairs at DOE, and you know as well as any of us that we're utilizing about 20 million barrels of oil a day here in the U.S. for all of our needs, most of it transportation. And since my first memory was 1976 on this subject when Jimmy Carter was president, and the big push was made, we've got to be less dependent on foreign oil. Now, this administration, in my personal view, is overselling electric cars and some of these renewable energy mechanisms. Not that we don't need them, but I don't realistically think that they're going to be able to meet all of our increasing energy demands anytime soon. but you've probably studied this even more than I have since you're head of policy. What is your realistic appraisal on our ability to significantly reduce the amount of oil that we're buying from the Middle East and other countries? And what kind of time frame from your analysis do you think is realistic?
I think the ability of this country to meet any great challenge is extraordinary, Mr. Chairman, and I believe that if we set our minds to it, that we can reduce our dependence on oil, reduce our dependence on imported oil, and we can do it by following a number of different pathways. I do believe that electric vehicles have tremendous potential. And by the way, not just to reduce our dependence on oil, but also to create jobs in this country.
Let me just make one comment on electric cars. The other day I saw a 1917 issue of the New York Times, and the front page was electric cars are the cars of the future. That was 1917. And so I just point that out, but I would like for you to go on with your explanation and talk about some timelines as well.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Fortunately, today we have new battery technologies like lithium-ion batteries that were in existence in 1917 that are transformational, that I think are really going to make a difference in this sector. But I fundamentally agree with the point you made about it's not just electric vehicles. I mean, we also need to pursue a number of other technical pathways. Biofuels have already been discussed, and biofuels have tremendous potential to reduce our dependence on imported oil and by also creating jobs here in the United States. And we need to do that with new advanced biofuels. We need to build the infrastructure to make that work. And we need to pursue natural gas as a transportation fuel. We have tremendous resources of natural gas here in this country, expanding dramatically. We need to improve efficiency. That will matter tremendously in terms of it. And then finally, we need to expand production of domestic oil as well. And we need to do it in an environmentally responsible way. That can make a big difference. So if we pursue all of these pathways, Mr. Chairman, I'm absolutely confident we can get off of imported oil in a significant way.
Thank you. Many of us had a lot of frustrations up here about some of the money, the way it was spent on the stimulus package and others. And specifically, I want to ask you about this one. The first company that DOE chose to give a federal loan guarantee was Solandra, which is a solar manufacturer. It received $535 million in 2009. Since then, the information we have that the company has imploded. Its initial public offering failed. Auditors have raised questions about whether the company will survive, and it has closed one of its facilities and laid off 180 workers. Could you tell me what your information is on this company?
Yeah, I don't have specific information on that project to relate here today, Mr. Chairman. I'd be happy to follow up for the record on that, but I would say more broadly, this loan guarantee program has created tens of thousands of jobs and helped to put America in a competitive footing in some of these new renewable energy
Well, I mean,
technologies.
some of them may have created tens of thousands, but that one, they've already laid off 180, and I might also say that First Wind Holdings had sort of the same experience. So, I mean, I think all of us are encouraging people to develop alternative fuels, but to be spending this kind of money on failed projects is just irresponsible in my view. And then I want to ask this question also. We hear a lot about wind power, and everyone I talk to does not think wind power is a realistic major producer of energy anytime soon. And I want to know, have you all conducted any studies with any groups on the amount of land that is necessary to produce any meaningful amount of electricity from wind? I mean, I'm genuinely concerned about the amount of land that it takes to produce any meaningful amount of energy from wind.
Mr. Chairman, I'd say the wind power is already producing significant amounts of energy and growing in this country. It's been one of the major sources of new energy in this country for the past couple of years. There was a study done actually in the prior administration which pointed to the potential for wind power out in this country at the range of 20% and more in the decades ahead.
It'd be done without incentives. Right now there's a $24 per kilowatt hour incentive for wind power.
But the cost coming down, like it is with all these new technologies, And I would say on the topic of land that certainly land is required for some of these big turbines, but there's increasing interest right now in offshore wind all the way around the world. So I think this is another area where, with American innovation, American ingenuity and research, we can create the technologies of the future that are going to allow us to have cheap, clean, secure energy.
Thank you. My time has expired. Mr. Gonzalez, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me go straight to Mr. Hicks, because you said a couple of things that were rather interesting regarding DOD and the role it can play, obviously, as we go and search for alternatives. On page, I'm trying to see what page this is, actually. I think it's page 3 of your testimonies. The camelina grown in Florida and Montana, the algae grown in New Mexico, Hawaii, or Pennsylvania, for example, can be turned into fuels blended in existing infrastructure in the Gulf or on the east or west coast to power the fleet. So you're saying that that may be a realistic alternative, in your opinion?
It certainly is a realistic and growing alternative for us, literally and figuratively. And it's one that we're seeing today. We are aware of a facility in Texas, for example, that's capable of alternative fuels, bio-based alternative fuels, 90 million gallons per year, and claiming at competitive prices with petroleum. So we're seeing that. What we're looking at is fuels that don't need new infrastructure, and that's both for the commercial sector, but also for us. We need ready drop-in fuels that don't require changes to our platforms and our engines, that don't require changes to our infrastructure to store and use the fuel, and that's exactly what we're getting by looking at these advanced biofuels. And to be clear, we're looking at these in 50-50 blends. So these are blended with petroleum, and that's a common point for the commercial industry as well, going to a 50-50 blend.
The production of these alternatives, would they still require some incentives, some encouragement in the way of tax credits and such that we have attempted to do in the past? Is that something that still would be in the mix?
Certainly that would help. That said, there are companies, and there are about a handful of those that are publicly traded now and are moving forward with their plans without necessarily those subsidies in hand. But certainly that type of support would accelerate the maturation of that market and enable those technologies in this country to be something that can be exported outside this country, and I think to the betterment of those commercial industries.
Okay. Let me ask you about the Department of Defense specific as far as contracting for alternatives. Are you allowed to enter contracts that are long-term? Because obviously that would have some benefits. There would be some predictability in the producers of biofuels, alternatives, and so on. What is the situation when it comes to DOD contracting long-term?
Sure. So for contracting long-term for fuels, and to be very clear, that the Navy and all the services purchase our fuels through Defense Logistics Agency Energy, which is part of the Department of Defense. Their limit is a 5-year offtake agreement to purchase fuels.
And I don't know the answer to this. That's why I would ask you, is 5 years something that works to the benefit of both the Department of Defense as well as the producers of the alternatives that we're seeking greater use?
Well, certainly as we've talked to the producers, 5 years for an emerging industry is not something that they feel is sufficient. And I know through legislative proposals, the Defense Logistics Agency Energy has put forward requesting as much as 20 years. What we've heard consistently from industry is 10, 15 years are needed. But I think where the Department of Defense is today is requested through DLA Energy upwards of 20 years.
Yeah. And full disclosure, Mr. Griffin and I have a bill to that effect. That's the reason I'm asking you. It's kind of self-serving, but...
Thank you for your support. I think it would be a help, as well as the ability to address some of the scoring issues that go with those purchases as well.
I only have 40 seconds left. Mr. Sandalo, I have a question for you, and that is, I know that the chairman had some doubts about electric vehicles, but I do see that's an increase in role. But have y'all been able to, or is there another agency or department who would be more appropriate, to factor in the increased demands on the production of electricity if in fact we increase the number of electric vehicles? Some could be hybrid and some would be like the Leaf, which is fully electric, but nevertheless you still got to plug them in.
Thank you for the question, Congressman. That's something the Department of Energy has looked at very closely, and the good news there is that we have a lot of excess capacity in our power generating sector at night, and when cars plug in at night, they're going to be able to refuel. Another piece of good news is that these electric vehicles are very efficient. They're much more efficient in terms of their use of energy than a standard internal combustion engine. So the technical projections that have been done say that even with tens of millions of these cars on the road, we would not be putting major stresses on our electric generating fleet.
Thank you very much. My time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Mr. Terry, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Hicks, appreciate your testimony here today and presence. In your opening, you made statements and suggestions about making the Navy vehicles more energy efficient. And of course, you also then mentioned that the major users of fuel are ships and planes. How do you make them more fuel efficient? How do you get better air miles per gallon for your planes and ocean miles for your ships? And follow that up, you can just make them more efficient. Why haven't you?
Well, we are making them more efficient, and the way you do that, and I'll speak both for our surface vessels as well as our aircraft, in many ways you can look at the coatings on those. And so for our surface vessels, for example, we're putting on hull coatings, propeller coatings to make the ships effectively slippier in the water, better able to flow through the water. We're also putting on stern flaps onto many of our ships, and where we can, where it's economically justified in the lifespan of those platforms, as they go through their dry docking procedures, we're putting those measures on board. With our aircraft, it's largely again looking more at some of the coatings we have on our aircraft, and again we're doing that. But there's another opportunity that we're working on. We have had some success with our surface vessels, and that's incentivized energy conservation program. We call it INCON, and it's a way for the skipper of the ship, as they go forward and plot out their course, if they can do that in a more efficient way, some of the savings that come from that can be used for other supplies on the ship, and then with the rest of that savings coming back to the Navy for other purchases such as fuel or training. So there's a cultural aspect to this as well that we're looking at, and we're also looking at the so-called hotel loads on the ships. So not only as they're underway, what do we really need to power and when, and then certainly as they plug into the shore and literally plug in and get much of their power from the shore, how can we reduce the energy on there to the limited to what's really required to maintain the combat readiness of that craft. So we're doing these, and we're exploring many other opportunities as well. But the ships and the aircraft we have today are the ones we're going to have for the future. So being more efficient is critical to that, but also finding alternative sources of fuel.
Let's go into that quickly. And you had mentioned coal to liquid, and in fact, a few years ago, that was a major push by the Department of Defense for national security and defense security in having a domestic source that's reliable and secure. Where is the Defense Department overall, Navy, on production of aviation fuel or diesel fuel from coal? Has that been shut down?
Well, the Navy, I can't speak for all the Defense Department, but the Navy never really had a coal liquid certification program. The Air Force has had that program. They're also testing hydro renewable fuels, jet fuels, as we are. Our path has been more with the hydro renewable jet fuels. We will have tested and certified every surface vessel and every aircraft frame by 2012 to use 50-50 blends of alternative fuel, hydro.
Is the Navy's position that they would like to have a coal to liquids program? You had mentioned that in your statement.
I don't believe I mentioned it, sir, and if I did, I misspoke. But I think we are very comfortable with the program that we're on, and we feel that that is the best near-term solution for the Department of Navy, is one that's focused on alternative biofuels. The challenges with coal to liquids, it has been mentioned before, it's a technology that's been around since pre-World War II Germany. The challenges there are the capital expenditures required, $5 to $10 billion, the amount of water and the sources of water that you need for that, the amount of waste that's generated from those plants, and then certainly there's the carbon picture there, which is typically those plants without carbon capture and storage.
In my last
that hasn't been done in this country.
I interrupt, but
sure.
I have been told that their Navy has used aviation fuel blend with the aviation fuel from algae. Can you tell me how that's worked?
It's worked flawlessly. I've actually had the privilege to sit down and with the pilot of the F-18 that used the 50-50 blends of biofuels. Part of what we, what's one of the things that we require is that the ready drop-in fuels, the blends that we have, is transparent to the end users, and does not sacrifice or any part of our mission. And that's what we're finding today. So F-18 Hornet a year ago in April flew at Mach 1.2 and has since gone through its entire envelope with not any sort of issue at all with the fuel. And we're finding that same case in the Rayburn command that we've tested, Seahawk helicopter, and the other platforms that we see. Algae is one of the biofuels or feedstocks that we've used to date. It's not the only one. We've also used camelina, and there are many other types that would be that could be grown in again all 50 states in the country, and we're seeing that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Waxman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sandalo and Mr. Hicks, would like to thank you for appearing before us. Mr. Hicks, our armed services sit at an interesting nexus in our energy policy. They're both the biggest single user of energy and also reliant on the civilian energy infrastructure. Because of these two factors, they can be a significant catalyst for helping the nation transition to a clean energy future by advancing new technology and leading the way for the development of new commercial transportation fuels. In 2007, we enacted the Energy Independence and Security Act. Section 526 of that act contained a provision to ensure that long-term government contracts are not used to prop up dirty, unsustainable fuels. Mr. Hicks, from the Navy's perspective, what signal has Section 526 sent to industry and the armed services? And can you explain what the result has been?
I can explain that from the Department of Navy's perspective, again, not speaking for Department of Defense or the administration, but what we've seen is in working with, again, industry, from the refiners and the companies themselves to the equity communities that support them, is that they're responding to that, and they're holding themselves to that higher standard, not only on greenhouse gas emissions as 526 requires, so we see that as an effective policy tool, but also on things such as food security, water use, land use, indirect and direct, and they're holding themselves to that higher bar because, well, I'll leave it to them to describe why, but that's what we're seeing as a trend.
Well, you mentioned the algae-driven jet fuel the Navy purchased from Subcommittee. I had the opportunity to visit their operation in Northern California. It's the world's first 100% algae-based jet fuel. And you have mentioned there are other things along those same lines. This seems to be the right result from the market signal that has been sent by Section 526. Is that right?
Yeah, it does. And I think, as you mentioned, Solzyme is a great example as a company that literally started in a garage, as I understand it, and has, as of a week ago, just went public and was oversubscribed by 10 or 12-fold. So. And hundreds of jobs coming along with that, but bottom line, providing fuel for us in the areas where we've used it for the testing and certification, blended with traditional fuels, and again, transparent to the users. It's been an effective tool. The market is responding to this and is ramping up to support it. And I would also say that private equity, in our conversation, multiple conversations with them, is lining up well, and they're starting to see these companies with some very solid business plans and business models, and supporting them as well.
The bill that's before us for discussion would repeal Section 526. From the Navy's perspective, from your perspective, would repealing Section 526 send the right signal to industry and the armed services?
I think, again, we're comfortable with 526. It's an effective policy tool. It's having an effect on the market that I think is one that is the right direction, in the sense that it's providing not only clean fuels, but fuels that ultimately will be competitive. And I think that's what we're looking for.
It in effect means the armed services and the Congress are consistent in the message that we must pursue new, more sustainable fuels. I think that's an important policy that we want to continue. Mr. Sandalo, the bill before us purports to be a roadmap to our energy future, but it omits key policies that many recognize are critically important. For example, it does not even mention energy efficiency. The legislation also fails to mention technologies that show so much promise and are just now beginning to be commercialized, like electric vehicles. Instead, it seems to be a proposal to return to the energy policies of the Bush administration, with a focus on drilling in the Arctic refuge and the outer continental shelf. Mr. Sandalo, can you discuss whether this legislation identifies the right areas for us to focus on as a roadmap to our energy future?
Well, thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Let me just emphasize in response to the point you made about energy efficiency. I talked to a power plant executive recently who told me that the cheapest power plant for him is the one that he doesn't have to build. And he underscored the tremendous potential in this country to improve our economic performance by saving energy, by stopping the wasting of energy. So any comprehensive energy plan for our country needs to include energy efficiency, which some people call the first fuel. It also needs to emphasize innovating. And we are an extraordinary nation. Through our history, we have innovated and succeeded by doing so. The energy race in the next century is going to be absolutely central. And I think government and business working together can help position the United States in this global competitive marketplace.
If this committee were to craft an energy policy to meet our nation's needs now and in the future, would the department be willing to work with us and support those efforts?
Yes, Mr. Ranking Member, very closely.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. McKinley, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Since I've come to Congress now, 140 days now, I've come to really understand more the frustration of the process here. I've really come to the characterization, coming from West Virginia, that's a coal state. I really can sense a strong disdain in this administration for using coal. And it manifests itself time and time again. Even at the White House the other day, how the president mischaracterized fly ash as being poisonous and running in our streams and killing our marine life. Just patently false. I see in Wellsville that there was a coal liquefaction facility planned for there to create diesel fuel, airplane fuel for our military. That's been held up by permitting. There was a facility constructed in Marshall County, West Virginia, in the 60s with a coal liquefaction facility there. I'd ask you, I guess, Ms. Sandler, that might come from you. No one has records of that we can find. Is that something that you could get back, that plant was operating for numbers of years to prove the viability of that technology and conclusions? As I recall from the 60s, that there was something that as long as petroleum was over $40 a barrel, and that's age ago, that's before inflation obviously, that it was commercially viable that we could take coal and liquefy it. Could you possibly try to find that some of those old findings so we could refresh that? It's just a ongoing characterization I have of this administration that they're avoiding. Y'all seem to be avoiding accountability. I'm an engineer. I want to solve a problem, not take on more problems. Once I identify, and we've got issues out here, and we never seem to finish them. we've talked, we know about liquefaction, we know about some of these things, but no, let's take on another project so that we never conclude that project. Clean coal technology, everyone was thumping their chest over the years. We're going to have clean coal technology. We're going to put more money into research. And then when the president submits his budget, he slashes the money for the National Energy Technology Lab from clean coal technology. It's just so blatantly evident that you all don't want to use coal. So now my question would be, if we can, I guess we just have to wait you out. 2 years, we'll find out. But let's nuclear. Can we not use the spent fuel rods? And then you all have, I mean, participated in the Yucca Mountain projects on hold, correct? Can we put fuel rods in Yucca Mountain today? The answer is no.
Congressman, if I could, first I want to be sure to respond to the question you asked about the specific plant you mentioned, and I'd be happy to, I'm not familiar with that particular plant, but be happy to look into that for you and follow up on that. Second, I want to state clearly that coal is a vital energy source for this nation, that it's one that is essential for our future, and it's one that this administration is committed to as an important source of energy for our country. And that's one reason that we have invested so much in our coal future, in funding for clean coal research, in funding for deployment of carbon capture and storage technologies, and a variety of other programs that are going to make the difference for this country. And I've had the privilege of visiting the National Energy Technology Lab in your state, Congressman. I think it's a real jewel of the Department of Energy lab system, doing important work in this area. So I hope something we can work on.
It's the permitting process. The EPA has become a rogue agency. They're pulling permits from mines that are shutting them down that were operating for 4 years. It's Spruce Mine down in Logan County. They pulled the permit for Dana Mine in northern West Virginia over water permit. These are operating mines. I want to get back now to the point. I think it's clear where the administration is. They don't want to be held accountable. They want to continue doing research rather than finish the job on what they are. And one of those elements is coal. But I want to go back to nuclear. Is there any way that we can take those spent fuel rods, instead of storing them on site, is there any way that we can use them for the military in fueling our ships, that once they've been completed, their life cycle is finished for creating energy?
We can take that one back for the record, sir. I'm not able to speak to that today.
Do you have any?
Yeah, I know this. I mean, this committee's had extensive conversations about Yucca just this week, Congressman. I know, and my colleague Pete Lyons was up here testifying on exactly this topic. I know he's answering extensive questions for the record from your committee on exactly this topic. So.
But right now, we cannot store any fuel rods at Yucca Mountain. Is that correct?
Right. I mean, Yucca Mountain, of course, Congressman, is right now not in a position, and it is
$15 billion
the blue ribbon
spent, and we can't put anything in it yet. Sorry, I've run over my time.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a number of questions. My first one is for Mr. Hicks. Section 526 of the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 sought to limit the DOD's ability in their contracts for fuels derived from coal to liquids, fuels, or non-conventional oil sources, such as Canadian oil sands. Advocates of Section 526 claim it was supposed to impact the purchase of fuels that were made available to the general fuel supply for environmental groups are suing DOD for purchasing fuels derived from oil sands. Is it practically possible for the DOD to determine which fuels are derived from Canadian oil sands or which are not in the nation's general fuel distribution system?
Congressman, I appreciate that question. I think the best way for me to answer is really take that one for the record. That's really a better question, I think, for Defense Logistics Agency Energy, who's the one that's purchasing the fuel on behalf of the services, to answer. I'd prefer that take that for the record, sir.
Well, I have refineries that bring in crude oil from lots of different places, and the result is aviation fuel. And you can't tell if the aviation fuel meets the criteria, whether it comes from the Gulf of Mexico, Saudi Arabia, or even Canadian oil sands. So.
Yes, Congressman, I know that's a challenge in how they can find that accounting and can do can kind of track where that drop of fuel and barrel of oil came from. But it's one that's probably better suited for DLA Energy to respond.
Thank you. Ms. Sandalo, on Wednesday, the last question from my colleague, our Environment Subcommittee had a hearing on Yucca Mountain. In that hearing, we discussed the need to develop at least one interim storage facility to ease the burden of the storage dilemma. The President has said, and he supports investments in alternative fuels of energy, and Secretary Chu testified before this committee that we're unable to meet the President's goals if we not continue to invest in nuclear energy. This, of course, means that we'll have to have an increase in nuclear waste, and we need to safely store it. So the dilemma remains, we'll need to resolve the situation sooner or later. In June of 2009, the DOE withdrew its proposed Global Nuclear Energy Partnership Technology Demonstration Program. This program would explore different ways to recycle spent fuel, much as the French system. If the administration does not support long-term storage at Yucca Mountain or recycling fuel rods, but remains insistent on we must rely on energy sources such as nuclear, then just what do we intend to do with this nuclear waste? Is there an alternative? Because I know the French have been, recycling those rods for at least 20 years.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for the question, Congressman. It's very important and along the same lines, Congressman Kinley. This is a topic that is being addressed by Blue Ribbon Commission appointed by the Secretary of Energy, composed of some of our nation's leading experts on this topic, and their report is expected this summer. So I defer any further question, an answer on that, any answer on that to the Blue Ribbon Commission.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, we might need to have the Blue Ribbon Commission come up sometime because I wasn't in Congress in the 80s when the decision on Yucca Mountain was made, but obviously, hopefully they had a Blue Ribbon Commission in the 1980s to make that decision. Let me ask some questions also. H.R. 909 has set up a reverse auction to incentivize renewable energy development. I have some concerns on how the details are laid out in the legislation. Ms. Sandalo, you testified about the Department's experience with reverse auction for cellulosic biofuels, which has yet to achieve its objectives. The cellulosic biofuels industry, which was expected to take off, has stalled, and last summer's call for bids in the reverse auction went unanswered. Clearly, reverse auctions must be carefully crafted in order to achieve the dual goals of saving money and incentivizing production. Several aspects of reverse auction in this legislation may be problematic. Reverse auctions have potential as an incentive for renewable energy development, but it's clear from DOE's experience that the details matter, and if our committee develops legislation on the matter, we'll be mindful to do so very carefully. For example, to be eligible to participate in reverse auction, facilities have to have power purchase agreements in place. My question to Ms. Sandalo is, what stage of development will a renewable energy project developer enter into a power purchase agreement?
Well, I think the way that relates to the reverse auction is something that will need to be worked out in the course of discussions about this legislation, Congressman. I agree completely with the point you're making that reverse auctions have tremendous potential. They're an important market-based mechanism, but the details do matter in terms of how we work that out.
Is there any portion of the renewable energy sector, in your estimation, has progressed to that stage?
I'm sorry, Congressman, when you say that stage?
To the stage of even talking about a power purchase agreement.
Yes, absolutely, Congressman, there are.
And the facilities that reach that stage, will they have done so without the benefit of federal loan guarantees, including DOE loan guarantees and loan guarantees administered by USDA for biofuels?
That's a good question, which I'll take for the record, Congressman.
Okay. If I don't expect you to ask about USDA, but if you could, if they've done it without the Department of Energy loan guarantees. Mr. Chairman, I know I'm out of my time. I'll submit the rest of the questions.
Okay. Mr. Olson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I seem to be the guy who always comes up when votes are being called, so I will try to be brief. But thank the witnesses for coming today. Thank you for your expertise. My first question is for you, Mr. Sandalo. As you know now, the U.S. is the largest producer of natural gas in the world, and there's great potential there to improve our energy security, our national security. Hydraulic fracturing advancements in horizontal drilling techniques have been the key to developing these resources. President Obama, in the State of the Union and much of his energy speeches this year, has said natural gas is a big part of our energy future. EPA is studying the fracturing process over concerns about contamination of drinking water. But Administrator Jackson admitted on the Hill over on the Senate side last week that there are no known cases of contamination as a result of hydraulic fracturing. Last year, in a reference to hydraulic fracturing, Secretary Chu was quoted as saying, this is a quote, "We're going to have some regulation going on that." Let me read that again. We're going to have some regulation going on that. So basically, DOE he's looking to have DOA doing some regulation. And has your agency been actively pursuing any regulations over the practice of hydraulic fracturing?
Congressman, thank you for your question. A couple of points in response to it. First, I would emphasize that the technical progress that we've made in shale gas in the past couple of years is extraordinary and impressive, and that much of it started with funding from the U.S. Department of Energy. It's a great example of the important role of the federal government in spurring technological innovation. At this point, on your question about the environmental impacts, the Secretary of Energy has asked his advisory board to take a look at this issue, and in fact just this week that advisory board has been meeting looking at technologies that will allow us to develop our shale gas resources using hydraulic fracturing and do so in a way that minimizes environmental impact. And that's been the main focus of our activity at the Department of Energy on this topic.
Okay, but there's no known contamination of drinking water from a DOE perspective, correct?
I don't have specific information on that, Congressman. That would mainly fall into the purview of the Department of the Environmental Protection Agency.
I couldn't agree with you more that the government has a great record of investing in research, but once we get beyond that, regulate stuff, that's what muck it all up. And it's my concern that we don't have, continuous things, DOE, EPA, we just need to keep this resource going because, again, our natural gas reserves are about a century right now. Clean source of energy, serves the power generation, probably of transportation, the next, replace gasoline. It's something we can do right here, develop it right here in our country, American job, decrease our dependence on foreign source of oil. Mr. Hicks, I appreciate your comments today about the Department of Defense and the Department of Navy's dependence on fossil fuels. If I understand your comments from my colleague, Mr. Terry, DOD, the progress you're making isn't because you're changing fuels per se, it's because you're doing all sorts of things outside, streamlining the airframes, doing what's on in the propellers and all those type of things, the screws on the surface ships and subs. And obviously, wind and solar aren't going to be used for those products, our carriers, our subs, not clearly our airplanes. I mean, they can't get that done. So fossil fuels are going to be a big part of our future, and they're very specific fossil fuels. I'm out of Navy, naval aviator, and we flew in JP5, 4, JP5, JP8. JP8 was on every carrier because it was specifically designed to have a lower flash point so we weren't going to have some of the fires we've had in history, like the USS Forrestal during the Vietnam War. And that's a very special fuel. And most of that, a lot of that is built's not the right word, but is processed in the district Congressman Green represents at the Shell facility in Deer Park, Texas. And it's again, if it was made more difficult to obtain these fossil fuels, would that have a weakening effect on the military of today?
Certainly, that would have an effect, and I think it speaks to our overall energy strategy, which is both one of efficiency and one of finding domestic alternative sources so we can be more independent in our fuel choices. And again, the waypoint that we're going toward is a 50-50 blend of the JP5 that you mentioned and hydro renewable jet fuel, and likewise F-76 marine diesel. And a combination of HRD, hydro renewable diesel fuel for our surface vessels.
Thank you for those comments, and I'm about running out of time, but I know you share this sentiments. But our job, our main job of our military, is to kill our enemies, and our job here in Congress and your job is to give them all the equipment, the proper fuel they need to do that, and not to be some sort of test bed for some future source of energy. Other people can do that. We need you to have your fuel and fossil fuels for as long as you need it, to have the best equipment out there that's second to none. I yield back the balance. Thank you.
Mr. Inslee, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Santalone, for being here. Glad you're on duty. And I want to ask you both about biofuels potential. I'm going to be a little parochial, talk about the state of Washington for a moment, because we really have an aggressive effort to develop
a biofuels industrial base in the Pacific Northwest. There's a very active consortium with Boeing and a host of civilian aviation firms, and we appreciate Secretary Mabus's leadership on this. He was hugely excited on Earth Day last year in the Rose Garden when he announced that we'd had our Green Hornet first time break the sound barrier using biofuels. That was pretty exciting news. So I guess the question is, what could we do to facilitate a bioreactor actually going in out in the Northwest? How could we help that effort, and what's the status of those considerations?
Let me just start by thanking you, Congressman, for your longtime leadership on these issues. I've learned a lot from reading what Mr. Inslee has written.
And I knew there was somebody out there. I wasn't sure.
This is an extremely important area for the country, and one with tremendous potential. I'm going to have to take back the specific question about the opportunities in the state of Washington and come back to you on that. But there's no question that overall this country can create jobs and reduce our dependence on oil with investment in new biofuels technologies. We just heard what I think is an amazing American story about taking a fighter jet to Mach 1.2, you said, I believe, and using American-made biofuels from a technology nobody would, I think, believe is possible 10 or 20 years ago. That's exactly the type of thing that we can do. And the future, I think, I've heard experts say that the next stage in this industry is scaling up commercial-sized biorefineries that will get significant volumes of biofuels that have been tested at bench scale up and into the marketplace. And I think it's very important that we look at ways to do that in the years ahead. Important that we continue the research in these new types of feedstocks that are really going to make a difference in the years and decades ahead.
And if I could add, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the Green Hornet actually has now gone to Mach 1.7. Commander Weaver, Pi, as he's known, I think would want it to be known that he's taken it to its full limit with no challenges at all to the fuel whatsoever. Certainly, we know of a couple of companies in the state of Washington that are doing great work. Altair Fuels is one, and I believe Imperium is another. And we're watching those companies as they mature. In terms of your question, I think just continued support toward alternative fuels is something that we can do as a country to help us and enable us to be more energy independent. As David mentioned, R&D plays a critical role in this, both in the near term and the long term. I think for our efforts, being able to test and certify the platforms we have and be able to accomplish those missions at 100% of their abilities with no challenges at all with those fuels is something that we'd also just request continued support for.
Well, just to be a little parochial, there is an amazing consortium out in our neck of the woods, and we have multiple companies. Targeted Growth is doing genetically modified base. A company with some leadership in Washington State, Sapphire Energy, is doing algae-based. They now have commercial scale or pre-commercial scale ponds in New Mexico. And I know you'll be looking for soup to nuts, from growing to distribution to testing to commercialization. I think we are developing that kind of environment now out in the Northwest, and if there's any way we can help accommodate your efforts, that would be great. I want to ask you about coal to liquids. I'm a person who has supported the effort to develop cleaner coal to reduce CO2 emissions, and we supported here in the bill we passed in the House year before last, $1 billion+ a year to help develop a way to use coal in a way that does not significantly disrupt the climate. But the coal to liquids that I'm familiar with that are addressed in this bill, it appears to me, would actually go backwards from a CO2 pollution context in the life cycle of the product. If that's correct, then why would we want to go backwards to a product that actually is going in the opposite direction that we all know we need to go?
I would just say those are some of the questions that we have from the Navy's perspective, which are, I think there's some large questions around that technology, and may explain why some of those in that industry are pulling back or dialing back some of their efforts there. But the questions of the enormous capital expenditures needed, $5 to $10 billion, enormous water needed, as well as just some of the waste products that come out of that are all areas that need to be addressed. In addition to, and this is what's great with Department of Energy is dealing with and doing the research and development on carbon capture and storage technology, which can be used with the coal plants that we do have, the plants that have been providing affordable power for going a century now and will into the next, and using that technology focused on those plants, I think is something that could be an advantage. But for coal to liquid facilities, and to suggest that that's the near-term solution with all these other question marks, I think is something that needs further inquiry.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have one vote on the House floor, and so we're just going to take a little time off here. I think Ms. McMorris Rogers will be coming back, and when she comes back, I think she'll have questions for the two of you. But whether she does or does not come back, we will be back within about 10 minutes. Okay. So we'll be in recess until then.
Okay.
We're going to reconvene here. Hopefully I'll have some of my colleagues continue to join me. But we're finished with the second panel. So, Mr. Sanlo and Mr. Hicks, really appreciate your testimony. It was interesting, and I thought you gave good detail on your answers, which is much appreciated by this committee. So at this time, you're dismissed.
Okay, thank you.
At this time, we'll call up the next panel. While we're setting up nameplates and getting the chairs organized, our third panel is Neil Auerbach from the Hudson Clean Energy, James Bartas, Senior Policy Research, Rand Corporation, and Jack Spencer, Research Fellow, Nuclear Energy from the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Auerbach, we're going to start with you. I'll give us just a few more seconds to get settled in. Get your water, turn your mic on, and Mr. Auerbach, if you would begin.
There we go. Okay. Thank you very much, members of the committee, for the opportunity to testify for you today. It is an honor and privilege. My name is Neil Auerbach, and I'm the founder and managing partner of Hudson Clean Energy Partners. Hudson Clean Energy Partners is a global private equity firm that focuses exclusively on investing in the clean energy sector. With over $1 billion in assets under management, Hudson is a leading global investor in sectors that include wind, solar, and hydroelectric energy, in biofuels, biomass, smart grid, electric vehicles, energy efficiency, and storage. Given our position on the front lines of these fast-growing industries, we have seen firsthand the impact of government policies on private sector capital flows, both at home and abroad. New capital flowing into our sector is coming in at such a quick pace that we are already drawing nearly equal to capital flowing into new fossil-fueled fire power plants around the world. In fact, in 2010, the amount of capital in renewable energy power generation was about 85% of global capital flowing into fossil fuel powered generation. So this is becoming and is now a very big business. The increasing scale of our industry is causing dramatic changes in strategic thinking of industry players and policymakers around the world. Other forces at work in the energy industry are also causing a reassessment of strategic thinking, most notably the rapid advances made in extracting shale gas cheaply. While these and other forces at work are placing pressure on lowering the cost of power, upward pressure on the price of oil is occurring, leading to higher prices at the gasoline pump for motorists here in the U.S. and around the world. As the Chinese economy continues to grow, demand for petroleum will continue to increase. Today, China is by far the world's largest market for automobiles, yet on a per capita basis, the market penetration of automobiles is roughly about 1/20th of what it is in the United States. Imagine what will occur when they draw equal to the United States. While my written testimony addresses the reverse auction mechanism in Title III of H.R. 909, I just want to articulate first, although my specialty and frankly a majority of my network and my career is now devoted to clean energy, I am broadly in support of an all of the above strategy, and that strategy informing this legislation. And so I support the basic concept of using dedicated oil and gas royalties as a funding source to create a trust fund out of which payments will be made to renewable energy generators. It's important to understand why I believe so passionately in the future of clean energy and why I believe it is actually in the present. There are three basic reasons why clean energy is increasingly attractive to consumers and to policymakers around the world. It is good for energy security, including American energy security. It is good for economic growth, and it is also good for the environment. And I believe that by looking at all three factors, concludes that more clean energy, in particular renewable energy, is better than less for America's energy future. I want to focus, before getting into renewable, to the reverse auctions directly, on the chart which is to my right, and if you want, I can, if the camera can focus on it, just as an illustration to make it as clear as I can, with a chart that looks fairly complex. I will try to simplify it, at just how dramatic the changes are that I refer to in the in what is happening today in clean energy. Over the past 80 years, there have been obviously significant price movements in the electricity sector in the United States of coal-fired, gas-fired, nuclear-fired, wind-powered, and solar-powered electricity. And what this chart shows is how prices have come down as each of these power sources has scaled over the past roughly 100 years. The fastest declining cost for power is coming from solar, and that's the orange dotted line all the way on the right. Next fastest is wind, and then we've got natural gas and coal, and then nuclear, which to date has actually been increasing in cost. Now again, I'm not against any of the power sources, but ultimately I believe that the reverse auction mechanism that I'll address in more detail now speaks to the need to allow market forces to drive down the cost of all sources of energy in our economy. And so what we've seen here is enormous progress. Last week, the research director for GE gave his pronouncement that he thought that solar electricity will be cheaper than coal electricity in 3 to 5 years. My personal assessment from investing hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in the solar industry over the past 10 years is that it may be 5 years away, maybe a little bit more, but it is coming very fast. Just to give you a further example, the solar industry has grown from 2005 to 2011 15 times. The changes that are occurring in that industry alone are enormous, and they are going to bring cheaper power to Americans everywhere if we scale up the industry wisely in the United States. The reverse auction mechanism, first of all, very simply, there's a lot of confusion about what a reverse auction is, and I think Congressman Nunes addressed it clearly. A regular auction is clearly where one seller is trying to induce multiple buyers to bid to raise the price. In a reverse auction, the buyer is trying to do the opposite, and so there's a lot of window dressing or detail associated with how one constructs a reverse auction. But reverse auctions work, and they've been demonstrated to work, and I'll get into the Brazil example in a few minutes. The bill effectively proposes replacing the current tax credit system over time that has existed for about 18 years for supporting renewable energy with a reverse auction. Yes. I want to point out here that the reverse auction mechanism, in essence, works. There are some issues that need to be addressed, and I'll just mention two of them, and then we can get into the rest of it in questions. I believe that we need to remove the reverse auction from annual appropriations. Billions and hundreds of billions of dollars of capital can be mobilized in support of renewable energy in the United States, but capital will not flow if the reverse auction mechanism is subject to annual appropriations. And I think that the PPA issue that has been raised by several members, that's noted in my testimony, also needs to be addressed. In my written testimony, we focus on a recommendation to actually expand the use of the reverse auction to include all three revenue streams.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Mr. Auerbach. And Mr. Spencer, the Heritage Foundation.
Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, my name is Jack Spencer. I'm the Research Fellow for Nuclear Energy Policy at the Heritage Foundation. The views I express in this testimony are my own, should not be construed as representing any official position of the Heritage Foundation. Thank you for inviting me to testify before you today regarding the roadmap for America's energy future. I'd like to focus on the nuclear power provisions of that bill. Nuclear is among America's least expensive electricity sources. It emits nothing into the atmosphere, has a great safety record in the United States, including no injuries. Despite these facts, no plants have been ordered for over 3 decades. And many insist that there will be no additional construction without taxpayer backing. So this has been the basic approach of most policymakers. In fact, looking at many of the proposals currently under consideration, one might conclude that Washington thinks that it can subsidize nuclear energy into commercial viability. I would suggest, however, that a lack of taxpayer support is not the problem. The problem is an incoherent nuclear waste management policy and an antiquated regulatory system. The energy roadmap begins to address both of these areas. Ultimately, America's failed approach to nuclear waste management presents a substantial risk to the future of nuclear power. Constructing a nuclear materials repository is central to fixing this problem. Current law states that the repository shall be built at Yucca Mountain. The energy roadmap breaks the impasse over Yucca Mountain by establishing a 90-day timeline for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to determine, based on technical and scientific data, whether or not to issue a permit for repository construction. If Yucca is not suitable, the proposal sets forth a process to find an alternative site. But the roadmap goes a step further. It directs the Department of Energy to report back to Congress on the feasibility of both establishing an organization outside of the department to manage Yucca and of removing the fee ratepayers pay to the federal government for waste management services. Removing the fee would allow for a market-based system to emerge. It is this provision that sets the roadmap apart from its recent predecessors. Instead of attempting to fix a flawed system, this legislation allows for fundamental reform of how nuclear waste is managed. In a market-based system, instead of paying a preset fee to the federal government to manage used fuel, or in this case not manage used fuel, nuclear power operators would pay a fee for service. This could include simply paying a fee for geologic storage or a more complex suite of processing services. The key is to establish a pricing mechanism for emplacing nuclear waste storage in a geologic repository. Nuclear power operators could then decide, given the price to place used fuel in Yucca, how to manage their waste streams. As the price to access Yucca goes up, so will the incentive for nuclear operators to do something else with their used fuel. This should give rise to an industry that competes to provide used fuel management services. One could imagine a marketplace where everything from interim storage to full fuel reprocessing was available. The basic regulation would be that all the waste must be disposed of by the time the plant is decommissioned, and of course that everything is done within the guidelines set by the NRC to protect public health and safety. This idea is gaining ground. For example, Tim Eccles, a Georgia State Public Services Commissioner, recently published an op-ed in the Atlanta Business Chronicle supporting the approach. More recently, experts from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Federation of American Scientists, the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, and the Heritage Foundation, I would be the representative there, authored a report entitled U.S. Spent Nuclear Fuel, a Market-Based Solution. Even nations like Finland and Sweden are finding great success in waste management programs where waste producers are responsible for waste management. The energy roadmap also would reform how new reactors are permitted by creating a second permitting track that would allow for a permit to be issued in approximately 2 years. The expedited process would entail more efficient processes for both environmental and technical review. The bill also begins to build regulatory support for new reactor technologies. Without this regulation, new technologies are effectively banned from the marketplace. Customers do not want reactors that the NRC will not regulate, and the NRC does not want to put its resources toward a reactor technology that has no customers. The result is that new technologies are at a severe disadvantage. To begin changing this, the roadmap directs the NRC to develop a set of guidelines for technology-neutral nuclear plants. Allowing reactor designers to meet a general set of plant guidelines would represent a significant step forward in building a more diverse and competitive nuclear industry. And the final point that I'd like to bring to the subcommittee's attention is that the proposal would give the NRC a 90-day deadline to report to Congress what personnel and resources are required to establish a predictable regulatory program for small modular reactors. Like other elements of the bill, this provision moves away from the subsidy-first mentality that consolidates market power in Washington to a market-based vision that allows the actual commercial value of a technology to determine its ultimate success. That concludes my testimony. I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Bartis, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Mr. Chairman and distinguished members, thank you for inviting me to further elaborate on the testimony that I gave to this subcommittee on May 5th of this year. I will be focusing my remarks today on the policy implications of sections of H.R. 909 that deal with oil shale and coal liquefaction. As is RAND's policy, my testimony neither endorses nor opposes specific legislation. The United States has an enormous oil shale resource base, enough to support the production of millions of barrels per day for centuries. But getting a useful fuel from this resource is technically complex, requiring temperatures that are much higher than those used in processing Canadian oil sands. Moreover, nearly all of the high-value oil shale resources geographically concentrated on federally managed lands located in a very small area, roughly 30 by 35 miles, in Colorado's Piceance Basin and within a small portion of the Uinta Basin within Utah. That oil shale belongs to all of us. The public value is potentially tens of trillions of dollars. But reaping that public benefit, not to mention the energy security benefits of domestic alternative fuels production, requires the development of a commercial oil shale industry capable of producing a few million barrels per day. That level of production should be the long-term strategic goal for oil shale. At this stage, I don't know if that goal can be achieved. We are talking about a tremendous amount of industrial activity, especially when we consider supporting infrastructure within a very small region. Extensive measures will be required to prevent serious adverse ecological and socio-economic impacts and to protect the quality of the Colorado River. My analysis of the oil shale provisions of H.R. 909 is that they do not move our nation toward that long-term strategic goal of large and sustainable commercial production. My specific concerns are detailed in my written testimony. There are a few areas where Congress may need to provide direction so that the nation can realize the full opportunity that oil shale offers. The critical step is obtaining early production experience. Until we understand the performance of the process options, it is not productive to engage in establishing a detailed regulatory structure for a large multi-million barrel per day commercial industry. I suggest the following for consideration by the committee. First, require that the Departments of Energy and the Interior and the Environmental Protection Agency cooperatively develop and publish a federal plan for promoting the construction and operation of a limited number of pioneer commercial plants. That plan should be designed to attract America's top high-technology firms. Second, require that the Department of the Interior develop, publish, and implement a 15-year schedule for multiple offerings of small R&D leases. And third, require the preparation of plans for conducting critical environmental and ecological research and an assessment of the carbon management options in the vicinity of the federally managed oil shale lands. Turning to coal, here we have another enormous resource that we could be utilizing to meet our liquid fuel needs. Technical approaches are available to produce liquid fuels from coal or a combination of coal and biomass with life cycle greenhouse gas emissions that are comparable or significantly below those associated with conventional petroleum. Moreover, over the long term, liquid fuels derived from a combination of coal and biomass could provide a new market for coal that could counter the adverse local and regional economic impacts of reduced demand for coal in power generation due to measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I am concerned with the slow progress towards gaining commercial experience in coal-derived liquids production in the United States. However, I do not believe that government ownership of alternative fuels production facilities is a credible solution. If the Congress is interested in using the purchasing power of the Defense Department to promote early commercial experience, I suggest providing the Department with the authority to make long-term agreements to guarantee a minimum sale price to the benefit of the alternative fuel producer in the event that oil prices are low. In return for this benefit, the Department would negotiate a maximum purchase price that would be lower than world oil prices in the event that world oil prices pass the specified threshold. I would also like to make a few comments regarding 26 of the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007. The primary policy issue raised by repeal of this section is whether it is in the national interest to allow government agencies to promote the production of alternative fuels that have life cycle greenhouse gas emissions that are significantly higher than their petroleum counterparts. For example, repeal of this section would open the door to a government procurement of coal-derived liquids produced without any management of greenhouse gas emissions. As enacted, Section 526 places severe constraints on the government's ability to purchase fuels. This is because commercially available fuels might contain certain amounts of alternative fuels that fall under the prohibitions of that section, as was mentioned by the congressman from Texas. Congress attempted to correct this problem in 2010 when it enacted Public Law 111-314, but the language of Section 30210 of that law is very unclear. Congress should consider clarifying the meaning of that section. If the intent of Congress is to promote the early production of alternative fuels with greenhouse gas emissions that are comparable or very close and well within the uncertainty of our petroleum imports, Section 526 can be appropriately amended. For example, an amendment could allow government purchases of alternative fuels derived from coal if 90% of greenhouse gases produced during the production process were captured and sequestered. Such a provision would greatly simplify the ability of a coal-to-liquids plant to qualify for government purchase contracts. My written testimony contains a section-by-section review of the oil shale and coal-derived liquid provisions, which I hope you will find useful. Thank you very much, sir.
Well, thank you all for your opening statements, and this time I'm going to call on Mr. Terry for 5 minutes of questions.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Auerbach, fulfilling my promise, but it is one of the more intriguing aspects of the bill is reverse auctions and clean energy. So in the context of Brazil, you said you were going to tell us about Brazil, but put it in the context of what also you think would positively and negatively work in the United States to encourage more clean energy.
Sure. Certainty provides greater investment in clean energy infrastructure, and the current system we have, tax credits that expire every couple of years, has introduced uncertainty and has stymied deployment. The reverse auction mechanism in Brazil, which came actually, I think it was last year, the year before that was called the Pro-Infra feed-in tariff, had an average price for wind of about $136 a kilowatt, a megawatt hour. In the reverse auction process, auctioning off 2.1 gigawatts of wind energy in a number of different contracts, the average price bid was $74.40 in U.S. dollar terms. That came in below hydropower, which averages in Brazil about $80 a megawatt hour. That's remarkable. Some have criticized the auction for allowing too many speculative bids, but if you look at the list of winners, you see some of the largest utility companies that have very substantial balance sheets and are capable of transacting. So I do believe that the auction there was worked. And so the biggest difference between the Brazilian auction and what is in this current program is that you sell the power to the reverse auction agency rather than just one attribute. And so in our proposal, one way of solving the chicken and egg problem associated with needing a power purchase agreement to establish credibility before participating in the reverse auction to get the benefit payment that substitutes for tax credit is to be able to sell all the revenue streams through the reverse auction agency that would be administering the purchase and sale of electricity. So a renewable energy generator would have a price certain for all of its attributes. The three income streams are the sale of the power itself, the sale of renewable energy credits, which are a substantial portion of the revenue stream of a renewable energy generator, and the benefit payment that comes from the trust fund. And that would take some work to get that innovation into the law, and obviously we would need a bipartisan agreement, but I think it would actually streamline and dramatically increase the clean energy generation in the United States.
Does Brazil have a credit as well?
I don't think so, but I would tell you I would like to do more homework. I have researched, but we don't have facilities in Brazil today, so I may be missing a beat, but I've studied it, and I don't believe so. I think it's just one price.
So, but in your testimony, you mentioned multiple revenue streams, one of which is the tax credit.
Right.
The philosophy I think that we're working under is reverse auctions instead of.
Correct. And so what I mean, let me just make this as simple as I can, because there's a lot of complexity here. If I actually have companies that have several $100 million invested in clean energy generation in the United States and in development, what we want to do is to know how much money we're going to make for the sale of the electrons. And the way you get paid is through the power purchase agreement, through the tax credits today, and through renewable energy credits. And so the sum total of that revenue divided by the capital cost and minus your funding cost is how much money we make. And so if the clean energy generator knows how much money they're going to make and they can have that price certain, then you're going to have more clean energy generation because the market is determining it. The reverse auction mechanism is substituting a tax credit for a benefit payment, which I believe is more efficient on its own. So if the reverse auction only covered substitute tax credit payments, we need to solve the chicken and egg problem. There are other ways of solving it. Our recommendation is to have a more organized sale of renewable power through the reverse auction agency, which I believe can be used for a broader purpose, including the diversion of royalty payments into the trust fund and then the allocation to renewable energy generators.
Mr. McKinley, I'll recognize you for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just curious to get a sense of where we are in this. With the bill as presented, would you support it?
I would support it with modifications. If we got the modifications that we asked for, I would support it. As written, it needs further work in order to have its intended effect.
Thank you, Mr. Spencer.
I'm not in a position to support or not support legislation. I can say that I think that a lot of the ideas and policies put forth, certainly from a nuclear standpoint, really give us a new way to address some really fundamental flaws in how we do nuclear energy and gives us a future there.
Spartus?
I'd rather not comment on that. I haven't studied this.
I'm just curious because I think at least he's showing some imagination here and something that reflects a little bit on the use of coal. And as I started to the earlier panel, I've come pretty clearly to understand there's quite an aversion in Washington, and especially under this administration, to use coal.
Well, there's been a long history of Congress and the administration specifying how to do things as opposed to what the goals are. And as we pointed out with coal liquefaction, if we can do it with a small amount of biomass and coal, it gets you fantastic environmental benefits and it gets you very reasonable costs. And yet, the way we've structured some of our legislation, that option is not allowed, because as soon as there's coal involved, it doesn't meet renewable. And so I think there's, the goal of the Congress should always be focused on, what are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to achieve energy security? Are you trying to achieve lower greenhouse gas emissions? Use those as your goals, not specifying technologies.
Do any of you know from the coal industry whether the coal industry is subsidized? I hear that all the time here. Panelists, members of the other side of the aisle, talk about the subsidy on coal industry. Do any of you have any record at all of the subsidies on coal? None? I'm just curious, because it seems like we just keep chasing things down the stream. I won't use the cliche, but again, we just don't seem to solve anything. We get close to solving something. There was the Fisher-Tropsch process that was back in the 30s. Why aren't we just perfecting it instead of taking on something new? And maybe I'm being naive about the whole process. I'm thinking as an engineer that we would complete something instead of starting something new. It just seems like this administration and the whole process of, we don't have an energy policy. We don't have any plan to have an energy policy. Everyone talks about it, but there's none. And we don't want to be held accountable. We seem to be so much more filled here in Washington with symbolism, that we want to move symbolically to starting a new fuel process and new energy, when we have things that we could work. I can imagine just what would have been back in the automobile industry if we had quit making the first automobile and went with something else, but they kept perfecting it until it became the automobile, the vehicle that we use. Same thing with airplanes when they started in the process. Why don't we finish it? Why don't we just work? What is it, the economics?
Our discussions with organizations that are interested in promoting and building plants is that there is a residual concern regarding where world oil prices are heading. I mean, we all, because they're high today, we think they're going to stay high. And if you've got a large investment to bet on that, you're going to be a little bit more cautious. So there is downward potential. It could last, may not be very long, but could be downward potential. And that would cause something like a coal to liquids plant to be a disaster. And that's why we're talking about, in our analysis, looked at incentives that the government could provide that would be applicable to the first few plants. We don't like subsidizing production. We do think that there's a government role in promoting early commercial experience. And coal to liquids is one of those, or coal and biomass to liquids that's environmentally clean is one of those applications.
Thank you, Mr. Spencer. You have something you want to chime in?
Yeah, Congressman, I'm here to talk primarily about nuclear energy, but you've given me an opportunity that I find hard to pass up, given that when I'm not working on nuclear energy, I work on energy subsidies broadly. And I think the bigger issue here is, what is the role of government? And about these projects that have started and stopped, I would simply suggest that, with all due respect to all of the great men and women who work in this building and the one on the other side, and all of the great men and women and scientists who work down at the Forrestal building at the Department of Energy, that ultimately it's the marketplace that's the best arbiter of which of these technologies go forward and which ones don't. And if coal to liquids is the way to go, then people will invest in that and will do that. If energy prices are going to stay high, then that creates a panoply of opportunity for biofuels, ethanol, whatever the case may be. But we continue to use Washington and centralized control in Washington to distort the marketplace, so we never get any of these projects finished, rather than allowing and trusting the marketplace. And ultimately, it's the marketplace that has given us all of the goods and services that we enjoy today.
Thank you very much. I think I've run over my time.
Gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Pompeo, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Auerbach, you talked about the increase in capital flows into renewable energy. What drove that increase? You said, I forgot the time period, the last couple of years?
Yes, in the solar industry, the last 6 years I'm talking about, it was policies, government policies around the world. Most of that actually was happening in Europe with feed-in tariffs. The most notable of them is in Germany, which despite its relatively poor solar installation conditions is the world's largest market for solar energy. And it also resulted from improvements in technology. And several companies, many companies, have participated in that progress in the United States, in Europe, and in China. So the cost of installed solar has dropped roughly about 75% over the last 5 years. When prices drop, and they are going to continue to drop, it stimulates demand. And these feed-in tariffs, which started out very, very high, have been coming down extremely quickly. I'm not a personal proponent of feed-in tariffs as the way to go, because it's another example where the government is setting the price rather than the market, which is why I like Congressman Nunes's reverse auction approach. But the combination of market stimulus, the price signal, and technology progress has resulted in a transformation of the solar industry unlike anything I have seen in the energy industry over the course of my involvement in this industry for well over a decade.
I appreciate that. And I think the reverse auction is a step forward from the way we've done business. I can't imagine putting hundreds of $millions at risk depending on us to renew a tax credit every couple of years.
It makes me nervous.
Yes, I can only imagine the increase in the cost of capital that results from that.
The cost of capital has gone up much higher in the United States than anywhere else in the world. Because
so with all of these improvements that you described, why not just say, hey, just go away? Why not just tell us, go away, leave us alone, we don't need a reverse auction, we don't need a thing, remove the regulatory barriers that are in the way of all of these things, whether that's wind or solar or natural gas and coal, and we'll raise the money and we'll get it done, and we'll make money doing it, and make really happy consumers because they'll have affordable energy here in America.
Okay, that's a great question, and there are many who have suggested that. Let me, in answering that question, and I'm sure my other panelists here will have views on it, I'll also touch on Mr. McKinley's point. If you look at the history of federal expenditures in this country, there's been an analysis actually done for the Nuclear Energy Institute a couple of years ago. The vast majority of federal expenditures have gone to fossil fuels, something like 73%, including to the coal industry. Now, I didn't do the study myself, so I can refer you to it, and so you can look at the source material that I quoted in my testimony. And so the renewable power industry is catching up, and is catching up, as the chart shows, at a pace that gives us enormous confidence in the future. If you simply stop the music and then force everyone to find their seats, it may be that the wrong folks will not find a seat in the room that otherwise would be the winners in a few years from now. So what we need is smarter policies that allow market mechanisms to work more efficiently. Stopping the music right now and pulling all subsidies or all expenditures of all sorts, I think would increase the cost in the short term rather than reduce the cost. So I think we need to do this in a more gradual way.
I don't understand that. I don't understand how if the government got out of the way it would increase costs. You'd still, consumers would still find the low-cost alternative, and utilities would power their plants with the low-cost alternative, and smart people would go figure out how to make those curves come down even faster.
Well, what the reverse auction does is it actually allows the market, if the market doesn't need it, the market will not be asking for it, and it'll disappear on its own. So it allows actually for a gradual move to full market freedom to set prices. So I think the reverse auction mechanism is the safer way to get the same goal that I share.
Yeah, very good. I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. At this time, I recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, for 5 minutes.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Start with Mr. Arbach. On the reverse auction, I know one thing that you talk about, a lot of us get frustrated with, is when you see the White House trying to pick winners and losers, where government's trying to pick who's going to win and who's going to lose. In a reverse auction, can you maybe walk through some things in that type of process that would prevent the federal government from picking winners and losers?
Okay. Yes. What the bill currently provides is a division of regions and actually a division of technologies. There, what we're trying to do on the region side is to allow various resources in the country to be developed on their own. You see, if you actually have one national auction, reverse auction, you might have South Dakota taking all of the wind resource, but because there's a lack of transmission, you may never be able to evacuate that power to California, New York, or Chicago where you need it. And so a regional approach allows the realities of the marketplace to work well. So I think it's a well-designed piece of the legislation. What we also do is allow for, what the legislation does is allow for technology limits, 60% I think to one technology, 90% for two. And what that's doing there is saying that although wind today is the cheapest form of renewable power generation, ultimately because of these cost curves, you want to induce more competition and to see all these costs continue to come down. So the allocation of the auction among technologies, I think, helps to push the price down of all renewable power.
Thanks. So one of the things we've been hearing when you talk about impediments to expanding renewable energy, it seems like some of the same things we're hearing about impediments to developing some of our own natural resources in American traditional energy are seeming to apply to renewable energy, and that is overreach by the Environmental Protection Agency. Can you describe, especially as it relates to the long process it takes for site selection, things like that, can you describe what types of overreach you've seen?
Yeah, anecdotally, although we have a lot of development sites in California, it is well known, for example, that it takes 2 to 3 years to actually develop a wind farm in Texas, and it takes 5 to 8 years to develop a wind farm in California. I don't think it's the EPA that stands in the way. It's a lot of state environmental red tape that delays the pace of development in California in particular. But California is actually recently has been showing more progress, and so environmental tape is actually a problem for the renewable power industry, and so more accelerated permitting would allow, both on federal lands and also on private lands, would allow for faster deployment of renewables and cheaper deployment of renewables.
Thanks. Mr. Bart is talking about more opportunities for permitting for natural resources. I know one of the frustrations that we have in the Gulf Coast area is the inability to get clear guidelines from the Department of Interior, BOEM, to move forward, but also with the inability to get more areas opened up. When you talk to other states, it seems like there are a number of other states interested in getting into the game and helping produce American energy. And you know, it surely would be my goal to see us eliminate our dependence on Middle Eastern oil. Clearly, we have the capacity to do that with so many reserves that are completely shut off by federal policy. But if you can talk maybe about some incentives that could be provided that you know of that would encourage states to participate where maybe they're not right now.
That's a tough question. There's a lot, you know, from what we know, there's a lot of offshore oil that other states have, and the challenge is to move forward successfully. We know we have a tremendous amount of oil shale, which I just addressed it today, literally 3 times the reserves of Saudi Arabia. That look very attractive. We need to make some progress there. The only way to get progress is to get some experience, and that means we gotta allow people, give industry enough incentive, a big enough reward, so that if they go in there and figure out how to do this and thereby monetize this huge resource that we have as a nation, and to our benefit, you know, they'll move.
On increased revenue sharing to states who want to participate in the process.
Now, the revenue sharing, I mean, I can't comment on the revenue. I mean, the revenue sharing, I don't want to comment on that. I think there is already revenue sharing, as you're aware. And I don't, we have not looked at whether.
Well, we don't, I know in Louisiana we don't have any revenue sharing right now. It's not until 2017 that they kick in. But it seems like there are a number of other states that have.
It depends, yes.
If revenue sharing was involved, where they can then provide a stream of revenue to their state, there would be a big stream of revenue to the federal government as well. It seemed like kind of a win-win to encourage more.
Yeah, we haven't looked at that, and I shouldn't be commenting on things that we haven't.
I don't know if anybody else wants to comment on that. All right, yield back. Thanks.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Bilbray, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I apologize. I was downstairs at my other committee looking at government regulations that are obstructing economic growth, so I think we're sort of in a lot of ways looking at the same problem from different angles. First of all, being a history major, I want to go back and remind all of us that the oil industry was the environmental option to the oil, from the previous oil, was the whaling industry that provided the energy to light our lights. And the fact that the gasoline was just a waste product from the manufacturing of the kerosene. And so the whole concept of driving a car that was driven by gasoline was really just because we had all this, dangerous stuff around as a byproduct, a waste product that developed that. So I think it kind of tells us how innovative Americans can be and the human mind can be confronted with an opportunity and a problem. And now it's this huge, precious resource rather than trash from, leftovers. And how do we move forward with it? The other assumption I want to point out is, would everybody here agree with the concept that we need a Manhattan Project for our energy independence? We keep hearing that. My biggest frustration about it is somebody who's been in a regulatory agency one way or the other since 1976. Manhattan Project wouldn't be legal today. Would not be legal to do it today. And every time I just ask anybody brings that up, we need to confront that. My question is, when we look at these obstructions that the government, one way or the other, is standing in the way of, while we're talking about why aren't we doing innovative things, the fact is we require people to stay in the box and we complain about them staying in the box. You mentioned California. In fact, you may want to talk about this. We talk about how wind generation is so efficient. But do we talk about the fact that it needs transmission lines that are usually 3 times farther than traditional power? And the obstructionism, and let me give you the Sunlink. You know that one. It's twice to 3 times as long as it would have been if the federal government would have allowed the transmission lines to go over federal jurisdiction. No Indian reservation, no national park, but the freeways go through. You want to comment on the fact that it's okay to put a freeway through federal property, but not a transmission line to get to solar power?
Sure, I can't pass up that opportunity, Congressman. I'm concerned, obviously, I'm in the clean energy business, I'm concerned with the environment, but ultimately everything is cost-benefit, and the amount of time and energy and money that renewable energy development teams have to expend on figuring out how to get transmission to load centers from the wind resource, basically it prevents a lot of renewable energy from being built that could be both environmentally beneficial and also cost effective.
Give me an example. California implemented AB 32, talked about saving the planet, thought it was so important to be able to save the planet, put all those regulations on and all those mandates, but did not exempt it from CEQA. The California Environmental didn't think it was important enough to exempt it from CEQA because, they couldn't retreat on that. Same time, my colleague from California will remind you, they did exempt a football stadium in the city of Industry from CEQA, but not the implementation of AB 32. Can we agree that we should get away from the term renewable and go to clean technology or sustainable technology? I mean, words matter. And one of the things that frustrates me is to hear almost as if renewable is a quiche catchword, but really doesn't reflect the reality. Can we talk about the changing those terminologies?
Yeah, can I just
go ahead
address that quickly? Well, first of all, the name of my firm is Hudson Clean Energy Partners. I had the choice to name it renewable, and so I wanted a broader platform, and so I agree with the term clean. I would like, however, to just note that renewable energy, the resources themselves are also natural resources that are part of our national treasure. And so the sun that's shining in Southern California and the wind that's blowing across the Plain States are natural resources for this country that are worth trillions of dollars.
Okay, well, here's the point. To get into that, when somebody talks about electric fleets, when we talk about developing efficient wind generation, we're talking about permanent magnet DC motors and generators, okay? At that time, we talk about that, but we don't talk about the fact that if we're going to go to electric system, if we're going to have wind power, we're going to have efficient electricity, we've got to have rare earth at 70 pounds for every Prius, and you know what your wind generator is, but we are not talking about that the federal government will not allow private industry to go on to public lands and mine the rare earth that is essential to do all the things that everybody else. And we sit through these committees and hear colleagues talk about all these great plans, but they're not willing to allow the process to be legal to reach those goals. Things like rare earth, which is 98% coming from China.
It's only 98% or 95% of the production, not of the resource itself. The United States has plenty of resources. I agree with what the Congressman is saying. If we're going to develop more clean energy and use technologies that are now commercially available and coming down rapidly in cost, like electric cars, we need to have a resource strategy, and it has to be domesticated more than it is today.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that. And just to point out that the Prius are actually, the Toyota's actually designing now an AC motor, which is a lot less efficient than the permanent magnet DC motor, just because of the threat of not being able to get the rare earth material. And we get into it. And I apologize, I didn't get a chance to get in nuclear power. I think that we need to be looking at nuclear power and moving it like we did our interstate freeway, where the federal government is engaged. The DOD should be looking at siting facilities so that we can get the private sector doing what we do with freeways, not siting, not permitting, but building them after we go through the hoops, the regulatory hoops. And if we're not brave enough to go through those regulatory hoops, we should forget about the concept of being able to tap into this clean and cost-effective energy. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Bilbray, I think we're going to adopt a policy of giving you 10 minutes for your question. Mr. Arbach, and I noticed in your testimony you made the comment that a focused effort should be made on making the U.S. a more welcome home for clean energy manufacturing. And I was just wondering, what specifically would you be referring to?
Well, yes, thank you. If we would provide longevity to the system of incentivizing deployment, manufacturing will come to roost in the United States. The problem with the current system, and my personal problem is having to approve manufacturing facilities and generation facilities, is that we had to look at the clock. And when the clock runs out every couple of years on the system for providing incentives at the federal level, which are still today a necessary component, but and through reverse auctions will become a decreasing part of the calculus, it makes it hard to stimulate capital deployment that needs a multi-year payback. And so if we can have a reverse auction mechanism that had longevity and was taken out of an annual appropriations, then capital committers around the world would look to how to streamline the value chain to put in place in the United States those parts of the value chain that are going to actually help lower the cost of clean energy in the United States.
So you're primarily talking about incentives and more certainty on those types of programs.
The best thing that we can do to get more capital flowing, because the private sector, we are now in our portfolio companies building 2 manufacturing facilities in the United States, and there are many other manufacturers that would actually reopen plants for value chain components that have actually been shuttered today, and build new ones if they knew that this industry had a home for a multi-year period that was more market-based.
And what would be the impact if Mr. Nunes talked about that Ways and Means was looking at eliminating all tax credits and incentives, and Mr. Pompeo made some reference to that. If that actually happened, how would that affect your company?
I indicated to Mr. Pompeo, because he asked me that question, my preference as a policy matter is to see this being done carefully. Billions and billions of dollars of capital are already at work, and hundreds of billions of dollars are also looking to be deployed. And so I think Congress needs to move very, very carefully. And so by making any radical move, by, for example, terminating tax credits that have a statutory life and terminating them early, I think that it would have a deleterious effect on capital. It would cause the stock prices of public companies to fall. It would strand capital investment. It would cause loss of jobs in the United States. If we do so in a thoughtful, gradual way, as I think is the crux of the reverse auction mechanism in H.R. 909, I think that we will have the opposite effect of actually encouraging more capital to come into the United States and to find it a more secure home.
Do you invest in, does your venture capital firm invest in nuclear energy?
We don't. We're not prohibited from doing so, but for reasons that are been made pretty clear to capital committers it's not a very easy place to commit capital, at least for a 10-year time period.
Mr. Spencer, you, in your testimony, talked about Mr. Nunez's legislation providing a second permitting mechanism for nuclear energy. Would you explain just briefly what that is, how that would work, and why it's better?
Yeah. The current process allegedly takes 4 years. It's never happened yet, and each time we get close, it seems to not happen again. But what the roadmap does is sets up a 2-year time frame that if the applicant meets certain conditions, they are if you're building on or adjacent to an existing site, if you are if you have a reactor that is fully certified, and there are a number of others, then you get to enter into this separate track that gives a more efficient or consolidated review of the environmental and technical aspects of the application. It's a tight time scale, but it's one that I think a lot of experts think is doable if we establish that path. And that would give certainty, would allow us to get through more applications, and quite frankly, I think provide competition within the regulatory environment to demonstrate that you need to start getting these things done. Otherwise, we're going to do it a different way.
Yeah. Now, are you optimistic about these smaller type nuclear plants that sometimes people refer to as modular or whatever?
I think I'm optimistic that the technology can be applied commercially in the future, extraordinarily economically and efficiently and all that. I'm less optimistic that the policies that have been proposed will get us there. What we see is the administration and proponents of small modular reactors, what they want is a Department of Energy program where the DOE essentially chooses the 1 or 2 technologies that go forward to be licensed. I think that's the wrong approach, frankly. You have a lot of entrepreneurs out there spinning off technology, spinning off commercial enterprises. What if they're not one of the 2 that are chosen? I would suggest that it's the market's the better arbiter of that. Instead of going through the Department of Energy, I would suggest we get the Nuclear Regulatory Commission really geared up to be able to support this sort of activity, so that if people want to go down that road, then we have the regulatory support to do that.
Yeah. And Mr. Bartas, you mentioned Fischer-Tropsch. Other than South Africa, where is the Fischer-Tropsch technology being used today?
The Fischer-Tropsch technology is used in, most recently it's been built up in Qatar. In Persian Gulf, they're going to have about 170,000 barrels per day of production online this year. The technology is very up to date, but that's an application to natural gas. In our country, the only place that might make sense is in Alaska, because that gas in Alaska, no one's going to pipe that to the continental the lower 48 anymore because of all the shale gas. So we've got stranded gas up there. Applying it to coal is not a big deal, and we've got one firm scheduled to build a plant and pretty far along in Wyoming. They're not going to be using Fischer-Tropsch. They're going to be using a variant of Fischer-Tropsch called the Mobil Oil Company invented, but it's very much the same. But that's and they're going to be producing gasoline. They're not going to be producing fuels that would be of interest to the military.
Thank you. Mr. Gardner, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just got back from the hearing downstairs, so I will defer at this point.
Well, I guess that concludes today's hearing. I want to thank the 3 of you for coming in and giving us your views and opinions, which we certainly will take in consideration as we move forward, and we look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you very much. The record will remain open for 10 days for any additional material or testimony that anyone would like to offer, and with that, this concludes today's hearing.